My name is Bettina de Guzman. I'm a classicist, a mythologist, an educator, and a musician. I perform and sing ancient Greek and Latin lyrics with my replica ancient Greek lyre all over the world, making this beautiful literature and mythology accessible to the public. Join me in my travels as I interview various academics and authors regarding their passions and research and how and why they tell their stories. Welcome to Storytelling, Philosophy, and Reception. We are here today with Dr. Armand D'Angour, Professor of Classics in Jesus College, Oxford University. Hello.
Hi.
I'm so excited to finally meet you in person, in real life.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming.
Could you tell us a bit about Socrates and love?
So this is my recent project, a book about Socrates, though I've been thinking about it for at least 10 years. And what it does is overturns a lot of the standard views of Socrates as an old, ugly philosopher who walked around and did very little else until he was killed by the Athenian state by having to drink a cup of hemlock. And that's what most people know about Socrates. They think about Socrates as a philosopher who was put on trial for slightly murky reasons. You know, was it impiety? Was it corrupting young men? What do these things mean? Was there a political charge that underlay his execution? And then he was executed, and there's that dramatic scene of how he drinks a cup of hemlock, which affects you from the feet, and then it gradually moves upwards, and when it reaches your heart, you're dead. So I was teaching a couple of ancient texts which have Socrates as a central character. Aristophanes, the comic poet, who in The Clouds, which is a great comic drama which was produced in 423 BC, when Socrates would have been in his 40s. It shows Socrates not as this fat, old, ugly man that people associate because of some busts that come from his older age, but he's described as associating with others like him in the Thinkery, as it's called, a place where people go to learn how to study very strange and modern kinds of discipline, as long-haired, pale, and emaciated. So a thin, long-haired...
Quite different.
A very different image. And you know that the comic poet would have made hay out of the fact that Socrates was fat, ugly, and paunchy, if indeed he had been, and bald. But he doesn't say any of those things. So it's interesting that in his 40s, Socrates was still someone who could be described in terms that we don't actually recognize the later Socrates as being. And I thought, well, what was Socrates like as a younger person, given that that might be one of the earliest images we have physically of him? And what turned him into the kind of philosopher that we associate with Socrates? So we think about Socrates as this absolutely fundamental philosopher who contributed to the history of Western philosophy, the ethical questions which are still very much the fare of philosophical thinkers. How should we live? What is knowledge? What is truth? What is justice? What is love? What is courage? And that was a complete break, it seems to be a complete break from the pre-Socratic philosophers, the philosophers who came before Socrates, whose interests were wide-ranging, but essentially much more about what is the nature of the physical universe, how did the universe come into being, is it going to perish, is it eternal? Questions that are much more about speculation in the absence of astronomical science, for example, or physics as we know it. And Socrates, we're told by Plato, so Socrates wrote nothing of his philosophical ideas, he wrote down nothing. We have 30-odd dialogues by Plato in which Socrates is the mouthpiece. And in one of them, an early dialogue, so Plato was writing these dialogues after Socrates died, starting off by trying to defend Socrates from some of the charges which he had been executed for. So famously, the Apology of Plato is Socrates' defense speech. But in one of the earlier dialogues, the Phaedo, we learn that Socrates was interested in pre-Socratic ideas. He wanted to know things like, how does the brain work? Is it a function of the blood rushing through the veins? What creates thought? The kind of thing that even today we are unable to answer that question, really. What is the brain's interaction with the mind? So, of course, Socrates wasn't going to be able to answer that question, and the philosophers who claimed that they could answer those questions simply came up with assertions. This is the case, this is the case. And Socrates, being a very, very bright young man, was not happy with that. And he said, actually, we don't know. Most of what we're talking about, we just don't know. And so he decided that he was going to move from that kind of speculative assertion about the nature of the world. The early Milesian philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, and then Heraclitus, Parmenides, and so on, are talking about the world that consists of water or air or fire or logos, reason, or something that is apeiron was Anaximander's word. It's unbounded. But for Socrates, these things didn't mean very much. How are they going to help us to live? So he decided at some stage that his philosophy was going to be about how should we live. Now, you could say that was quite a radical move philosophically.
Do you think that has anything to do with his military background at all?
I'm sure it had everything to do with his personal background, which included military service. So one of the things that I was looking at was, what do we know about Socrates as a man that can throw light on Socrates as a thinker? And one of the things that we do know about Socrates as a man was that he was a very capable and experienced fighter on the battlefield. But the first evidence we have of him fighting is in the other main text that I started with. So Aristophanes' Clouds was one, Platos' Symposium is another, a dialogue with a dramatic date of 416 BC. So in it, Socrates appears at the age of 53, and written by Plato perhaps in the 380s BC, so sometime after Socrates died. But in the Symposium, we learn from one of the characters who bursts in at the end, Alcibiades, this famous statesman, much younger contemporary of Socrates, someone who Socrates said he loved more than any other man. A handsome, beautiful, dashing scoundrel. But we learn from the mouth of Alcibiades that Socrates had been an extraordinarily brave, strong, and courageous and efficient soldier at the Battle of Potidæa. That's the first indication we have of Socrates fighting as a hoplite, a heavy-armed infantryman, someone who would have to fight in full armour with a helmet, a breastplate, greaves for the shin greaves, with a sword and a spear and a shield.
Again, a very different
image, but this very efficient soldier who was so hardy that he could walk through ice in bare feet, and the other hoplites would look on him with a certain resentment because he was showing them up, because he didn't care about bodily comfort. He could go without food and water much longer than the others. He could walk through ice in bare feet. He was a soldier, and on the Battle of Potidæa, 432 BC, when he was 37, he was with Alcibiades, who would have been about 20, and they shared a tent, and he saved Alcibiades' life. And Alcibiades tells the story. He says, I'd rushed forward into the enemy lines, and I was going to be killed for certain, but Socrates rescued me, he brought me out safely, and he brought my armour back with me. The thing that struck me was, of course, this is an indication that Socrates was, one, a hoplite, so he had this panoply, and you needed a wealth qualification even to be a hoplite soldier. And everybody always assumed that Socrates was very poor. He came from a poor background. His father was a stonemason. And secondly, if he was fighting at the age of 37 in Potidaea, then presumably that wasn't his first battle, even though it's the first one we learn about from Plato. So hoplites tended to be trained from the age of 18. They would then be on active service from the age of 20 onwards. And there's every reason to think that Socrates had been fighting for at least, say, 15 years before that, maybe more. Maybe from the age of 20, he had actually seen active service. But that's trying to push back from what we know from Plato. Now, Plato only knew Socrates as an older man. Plato was born probably in 424. Let's say, by the time Plato met Socrates, say in 410, when he was 14, let's say he was a teenager and he met this man who he came to love and revere as his teacher. In 410, Socrates was already nearly 60. So that's when Plato would have known him, as a 6-year-old, someone who was no longer fighting. Historian, biographer of Plato, Socrates is made to say, when I stopped fighting, I put on a paunch and I became unfit, and I must get back to being fit. He sees these dancers, he says, teach me, these dance movements so I can get fit again. And so one has to imagine Socrates as an old fighter, probably quite bashed about a bit. He looks a bit like an old prize fighter in some of those busts that we have of him as an older man, in his 50s, with his paunch. He's lost his hair, so he's bald, it's a bit straggly. His features have become exaggerated as rather bestial almost, satyr-like. But that's not necessarily how we should imagine him as a younger man. And yes, so being a soldier, very important, pushing that back to when he was likely to have started fighting, and then recognising that the very fact that he was a hoplite soldier meant that he must have come from a background of some wealth. And that then ties in very well with a few other indications we get. One, which is everywhere in the Platonic dialogues, he's a very clever man. He knows things. He can quote Homer or Simonides or Sappho or Pindar at will. This is not the sort of thing you pick up in your 30s. You have to be educated as a young man to be confident. And so he was an educated young man, very supremely confident. He takes on the most clever men of the generation, the so-called sophists, in many of Plato's dialogues, and he beats them in conversation, essentially. Very competitive character comes across. It's competitive, highly educated. He talks in the Republic all about music. He knows a lot about ancient music, clearly, about the modes and about the effects of ancient music. In Plato's Meno, he describes the Pythagoras theorem in wonderful detail. We know exactly how, drawing the picture on the sand, we can work out what the square has to be if it's doubled in area and so on. So the whole theorem is described, so he knows a lot. There's a man who knows a lot and therefore must have been well educated from a very young age, and he can wield his knowledge confidently. So put all that together and you get a very different picture from the indigent son of a poor stonemason, which most interpreters have assumed. In order to assume that, they forget that in the Apology, Socrates is made to say, I chose poverty because of my calling. His calling is to seek knowledge. So he doesn't claim to have knowledge, but he claims that he has to spend his life seeking knowledge. What he says is that when my friend Chaerephon went to Delphi, the oracle, and asked, is there any man wiser than Socrates? So clearly he had a reputation. This would have happened maybe in his 30s. His friend must have thought he was this brilliant man, and famously impetuous, Chaerephon goes and asks the Delphic oracle, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? I mean, what a question to ask. And the answer comes back, no. And Socrates says, well, I was baffled. The god, Apollo, who speaks through the mouth of the Delphic oracle, can't be wrong. But famously, of course, he speaks in riddles. Socrates said, I felt it was my duty to work out what he meant. And I went to people with a reputation for wisdom and discovered that they claimed to know things, but they didn't. And I realized that what the god meant was that I am only wiser than others because I know that I know nothing. So that was one of the reasons that Socrates gives us, or through Plato's writings, for why he embarked on a life of seeking knowledge. So the idea is not that he is a wise man, in Greek sophos, but that he is a lover of wisdom, philosophos, philo meaning love, and that philosophia is the goal of his life, seeking wisdom. So it's incredibly postmodern, because actually he doesn't give us any philosophical answers. He actually says there are no firm answers. You just have to keep asking questions and stripping away the incorrect answers, stripping away the falsehoods, so that you'll get closer. Never actually going to get there. Now Plato takes that further and says you will get there only when you're dead, because your soul will be in contact with knowledge itself. Well, Socrates never goes that far, and he's not interested in saying, well, we will get to knowledge. He doesn't know. That's the thing. Socrates doesn't know and admits he doesn't know, but he knows that things aren't the case.
Speaking of philos and love, as in Socrates in love, can we talk about Aspasia?
Well, so my book is radical because what I do is I bring Aspasia into the picture. And the reason I do that is because, although Socrates said, as I just mentioned, the one thing I know is that I know nothing, he makes an exception in Plato's Symposium. He says, I can tell you the truth about love, which means that he does know something, he knows about love. But he said, I can only tell you the truth about love because I've been taught it. And I was taught it by a very clever woman. And her name is given in the Symposium as Diotima, Diotima in Greek, meaning honoured by Zeus, the chief of the gods, Zeus, or honouring Zeus. And people have said, well, we don't know of this Diotima, apart from in the Symposium. She is a fiction, and she is claimed to be Socrates' teacher in this hugely important, in fact, very central topic of his thinking, what is love, which he claims to be the only thing he actually knows about. He can tell you the truth about it because she taught it to him. Now, if she were a real person, she'd be really rather important. So there are, as I say, 30-odd dialogues of Plato. In only 2 is Socrates actually depicted as being taught something that he seems to take on board from his instructor. And those 2 are the Symposium, where his teacher is this woman, Diotima, and a dialogue called the Menexenus, in which his teacher is a real woman we know about from independent sources, Aspasia of Miletes. And in the Menexenus, Aspasia teaches Socrates how to give a funeral speech, which she claims to have taught earlier to her husband or master. I mean, she was married to or lived with Pericles, the leader of Athens, leading citizen for more than 30 years.
About how old would Socrates have been during that time period?
So let's say by 440 he's around 30. Pericles in 440 is the leading citizen in Athens, the general who makes war on the island of Samos in 440 BC. We have an independent history of that island, of the island of Samos, by a later historian who was also the tyrant of the island, called Duris. And Duris says that when Pericles conquered Samos in 440, he acted with enormous brutality. He crucified the opposing commanders and he threw out their bodies without burial. Now that should have led to divine retribution, and there was none, it seems. And what's interesting is that when Socrates in the Symposium introduces Diotima, he introduces her as the woman who postponed the plague by 10 years when the Athenians were sacrificing to ward off the disease. And nobody's ever interpreted this strange and very specific, datable comment that dates back to 440 and asked, well, if she did that, who was she? And the answer is very clear, because Pericles at that time, 440, would have been with Aspasia. Let's use the word married, because there's a bit of doubt as to whether he could have been legally married to her, but I suspect he was. But married to her for around 5 years probably by then. And in fact, the comic playwrights at the time said that Aspasia was the reason he had gone to war with Samos, because she came from Miletus. Now these are both in Asia Minor. Samos is the island off the coast opposite Miletus. They were famously rivals, trade rivals, military rivals for a long time. So she came from Miletus, she'd come to Athens, and she was supposedly someone who had instigated the war on Samos. According to the comic playwrights, not that you can't take them seriously, they wanted to attack Pericles. And so they attacked him by saying, he listened to this woman. So in the comic plays, he is called Zeus, the chief of the gods, because of what he does, because of his oratory, because he's so commanding, because he's the thunderer. She is sometimes called Hera, his wife, who tells him what to do, who bosses him around. And clearly, if in 440 BC he had done something like throwing out the bodies of his opponents without burial, that would need to be appeased, in the sense that the gods' anger might have then caused retribution on Athens if something hadn't been done. And if a woman is going to be in the picture as doing something, then that woman has to be Aspasia. Now, what she did is, a question mark. We don't know. I mean, that simple sentence in which Socrates introduces the woman who averted the plague for 10 years. I mean, it's very specific, is that we know the plague struck in 430. And in 430, in 429, actually Pericles died from the plague. So we have to think 10 years earlier, 440 to 439, was when people said, there's going to be a plague. Why did they say that? Because Pericles had done something that should have caused divine retribution. And Sophocles, the playwright, served on Samos with Pericles, and shortly after that, he wrote the Antigone, which is all about how the body, even of one's fiercest enemy, should be buried. So Polynices in the Antigone is thrown out without burial. Antigone says, no, he's got to be buried. And otherwise, there will be divine retribution. So one imagines that Aspasia would have felt something similar. Maybe, this was a suggestion made to me when I was giving a talk at the Hay Festival. One member of the audience said, well, maybe she said to Pericles, you've got to bury those bodies with due ritual burial, including sacrifices. And he did so. And so that would then explain this curious sentence in the Symposium introducing Diotima. When the Athenians were sacrificing in order to ward off the plague, she managed to arrange for them to delay it by 10 years. Now, they didn't know it was going to be delayed by 10 years. They just assumed whatever happened, his reburial, the sacrifices that were made, were probably responsible for the fact that no plague, no divine retribution happened in response to his behavior. But 10 years later, when it did, they said, it was delayed. And it must have been this woman who did it. So when Plato comes to write the Symposium, unlike the Menexenus, I don't think he felt in a position to name Aspasia as the teacher of Socrates who taught him the one thing he knows about love. Well, first of all, it would have been a hugely important thing to say Socrates learned these things. So if you read about Diotima's doctrine, the two things that effectively she introduces to Socrates are absolutely central to what Socrates goes on to do. And if you said, well, actually, she was the one who influenced him in that way, then her contribution is massive. And I don't think Plato wanted his readers to feel a real person who they knew as a very disreputable person. So Aspasia, of course, had been, as I said, written off by the playwrights as someone who instigated wars against Athens' enemies, who was much too influential on Pericles in a very misogynistic society. And yet Aspasia is this extraordinary woman who seems to be able to get things done, who seems to be behind everything the leader of Athens does. and who is honoured by her, famously more than any other woman is honoured. And that's where, of course, Diotima, honoured by Zeus, is the other beautiful proof that surprisingly no one has seen. The one woman who could be called honoured by Zeus, being the nickname given to Pericles by the comic poets, would have to be Aspasia. So if she, the Aspasia, and not some fictional priestess Diotima, had been responsible for the ideas she goes on to talk about, then we have to rehabilitate her as essentially one of the founders of the Western philosophical tradition. So these two principles are the principle of definition. So she says to Socrates, all the definitions of love we might think of, which require asking why X loves Y and so on, need to be answered first by asking, what is love? And she gives a definition in the Symposium. Of course, this is reported by Socrates and then reported by other people who then eventually reported by Plato, but so quite distanced, but nonetheless, she gives a definition that love is procreation in the presence of beauty. And procreation not just of real children, but of ideas in relation to the beautiful. So you have some relationship, you're looking at the beautiful, what is beautiful in the world, and you're coming up with ideas, or you're relating to someone who you find beautiful and you're procreating children. So that's the idea in the Symposium. And that's the principle of definition then. She says, let's define what love is. And the other thing she says is you start by loving individuals and you have a relationship with another body. And then you realize that it's not just one other body, but all the beauty in other bodies generally. And then you realize that it's the idea of beauty itself that you're loving. So love is, she says, it's like a ladder. At the bottom of the ladder, you're just attracted to an individual body. Then you're attracted to all bodies because of the beauty that is in those bodies. So it's a question of moving from the particular to the general. And that's Socrates' other main contribution to the history of thought. Let us talk about the generality. Don't give me a particular courageous act. Let's talk about courage in general. Let's talk about knowledge, not what you know about a particular thing, but what is knowledge itself. Plato then takes that further and talks about the form of knowledge, the form of beauty, the form of courage, as transcendent ideas that don't exist on the material world level. Plato does that, but we don't think Socrates did that. So Aristotle, who was Plato's pupil, actually says Socrates was not interested in the forms. That was Plato's notions. Whereas he actually says Socrates was interested in definitions and in moving from the particular to the general. That was his contribution. Well, if Aristotle is right, that's what Diotima has taught Socrates to do in relation to love. And therefore, if Socrates says that's the one thing I know, and it's the one thing he goes on to espouse in his philosophy, he's learnt it from a woman. And if that woman can be named as Aspasia, which I think these proofs suggest she can be, I think that's important for the history of thinking.
All right, here comes the really burning question. Was there a love affair between Socrates and Aspasia?
One of the things that we learn is that they had a relationship. So Plato, in his dialogue Menexenus, describes Aspasia and Socrates in quite an intimate discussion, with Aspasia teaching Socrates how to give a funeral speech, which she says she once taught to Pericles, and Socrates saying, I repeated this verbatim, and when I made a mistake, she nearly slapped me. So they know each other well enough, which for ancient Athens is an extraordinary thing, in position of quite physical intimacy. She nearly slapped me because I got it wrong. So what is the nature of this relationship? Well, interestingly, in the 90s, an inscription was found, and it was interpreted by a scholar called Peter Bicknell. It had the name Aspasios, the masculine version of Aspasia, and it showed a genealogy. And Bicknell realized that what this showed what was this likely to show at any rate, was that Aspasia came from quite an elite Athenian clan background. A family, her father's family were what were called Alcmeonids, which was the same clan that Pericles belonged to. Now, once this was discovered, the notion that she was this foreign, non-Athenian, Ionian, Asia Minor foreigner who had come to Athens needed to be revised. Although she was from Miletus being a city in Asia Minor, current Turkey, west coast, she came from an elite Athenian background, which means that we can reconstruct something of the story, and I do in my book, of what might have happened. Her father, Axiochus, married his daughter, who was Aspasia's sister, we don't know her name, to an Athenian aristocrat called Alcibiades, the grandfather of the famous Alcibiades who was known to Socrates. And Alcibiades, we know, the elder, was ostracized. He was sent into exile. He was obviously a politician with some dodgy dealings, or the people didn't like him, so they ostracized him, which meant he was sent into exile for 10 years in 460 BC. So we can reconstruct that he returned to Athens 10 years later in 450. He came with his wife, who was the daughter of Axiochus and the sister of Aspasia, and he brought Aspasia, his sister-in-law, with him. Now, she would have been around 20 in 450. Socrates would have been around 20 in 450. They would have met because they were both in the circle of Pericles. Socrates was already the tutor of Alcibiades. Aspasia was someone who, well, or if he wasn't already the tutor, he was to become shortly Alcibiades' tutor in 450. But he was already in the circle of thinkers and sophists, you might say, philosophers, who were known to Pericles. So we're told, one of the evidence, bits of evidence I use in my book, is that Socrates was the pupil of a man called Archelaus. Archelaus was a philosopher who Pericles knew and would have associated with. At the age of 17, Socrates was Archelaus' pupil. So one has to imagine this. Socrates, already known to Pericles, in that circle, in that milieu, gets to the age of 20, and then this woman, 20-year-old woman, comes to Athens from Asia Minor. Beautiful, intelligent, eloquent, someone who talks about matters of love. We have an independent source telling us that she spoke about love, Aspasia, to the elite young Athenians, including Socrates. And someone who is also so eloquent that she is able to teach Pericles, in due course, how to give the funeral speech he gives in 431. But at this stage, she and Socrates must have been known to each other. 5 years later, around 445, she marries Pericles. She moves in with Pericles. She is then 25, Pericles is then 50. But what happens in that 5 years? Well, one ancient author called Clearchus, who was a pupil of Aristotle, so some distance, but nonetheless someone who is known from his surviving fragments to have been an authoritative scholar, tells us in a simple sentence that before she was with, in Greek synegeneto, before she was with Pericles, Aspasia was with Socrates.
So clear, I like that.
Well, that's what he says. Now, people have interpreted the word in Greek as meaning she was a companion of, or she was a companion of, or she was formerly related to Socrates in some way, but actually it doesn't really make sense to me. It has to be that whatever she was doing with Pericles later in life, in other words, being with him, living with him, having sex with him, whatever it is, she did that with Socrates before. She was a companion of Pericles, but before that she was a companion of Socrates. So I think that comes close to suggesting that they did have an affair in modern terms. We have a Hellenistic poet called Hermosianax who actually says Socrates blazed with passion for Aspasia. That's in a poem. Now, Hermosyanax makes all sorts of silly things up. Sappho blazed with passion for Alcaeus or whatever. And so, he was interested in suggesting that there were lots of people who had fallen in love with each other. So we can't take that as serious evidence. But what we can take it as is, I think, some recognition that there was a closer relationship between Socrates and Aspasia than is generally credited. That recognition existed in the ancient world, and if the kind of thing that I have now elucidated about Socrates learning from Aspasia is true, we don't have to say they had an affair. We can perhaps say that there was a lot of interaction between the two in Socrates' youth that may have involved some kind of love affair, or love relationship. Now, what I imagine if I were a filmmaker I would want to suggest is that Socrates fell in love with Aspasia, and during those few years in their early 20s when they were interacting, he was an unusually clever but rather strange man. She was a non-Athenian, therefore seen as a foreigner, rather suspect, too beautiful and too clever for her own good, probably extremely envied by Athenian wives. And they would have been thrown together as being a bit eccentric. And Socrates perhaps wouldn't have cared as much as other Athenian men as to whether or not he was seen associating with someone who the Athenian women wrote off as a prostitute, which is clearly what they must have done. She has men coming to her to talk about marriage. She's kind of treated as a kind of marriage counsellor in one of the pieces of evidence by Aeschines, a pupil of Socrates, who wrote a lost book on Aspasia, which is quoted by Cicero. But anyway, so we have to imagine, what I would do is I suggest that he did fall in love with her, but she had her eyes on a bigger prize. She was in the circle of Pericles. Pericles had divorced his wife a few years before she came. And maybe she thought, actually, it would be good for me as a non-Athenian to get together with him, because he is by far the most powerful and influential man in Athens. And sure enough, by 445, Pericles has fallen for her, she's moved in with him, they have a son together. He had actually passed a law in 451 that Athenians could not marry non-Athenian women and have legitimate children from them. So he had to beg the Athenians to make their child, Pericles Jr., an Athenian citizen. So there would have been some obstacles to overcome, but nonetheless, she's with him at that stage. And one imagines that Socrates, having said, well, I love you, I'd love to be with you. And she says to him, but what is love? So you have, the definition thing. What is love? You think love is about attraction. No, it's about higher things. It's about, trying to make our society a better place. If I marry Pericles, then I have a chance to influence the way things happen. Okay, so that's your fictional scenario in which she does that. It's a way of letting the poor man down gently. He's in love with you, but what is love? And love is about things that are more than just liaisons between individual bodies, which is what Diotima says in the Symposium. So that's how I would play it as a filmmaker. This is Aspasia telling Socrates, sorry.
That would be such a classic meme.
Classic meme. Not interested in you. What is love? I'm interested in
How to break up with someone.
How to break up with someone, yeah. But it was that sort of thing. So, I love you, Aspasia. Well, what do you mean by love? And if you just mean you want to have sex with me, well, love is not just about that, all right? So what is it about? Well, we know from the ladder of love that Diotima says eventually it's about loving beauty and truth and knowledge itself, the form of love. But I think there's some fascinating evidence which I touch on in my book. If Aspasia did indeed help Pericles write the funeral speech, and if that funeral speech is the speech that is to some extent preserved in Thucydides' history, then we can look for ways in which we can say, well, actually, you can see the influence of Aspasia on the speech. And one rather curious bit is where Pericles says to his Athenian audience, he says, you should be lovers of your city. And he uses the word erastai, meaning people who have eros, passionate love. And you wonder, well, I wonder, is that something that Aspasia said? You know, people shouldn't just be loving each other's bodies, they should set their sights on something higher, some political love, and be lovers of their city. And then Pericles uses this phrase, you should be lovers of your city and you should set your gaze on her day and night. He says something, you know, that is almost romantic. You should be romantically in love with Athens. Now, Socrates wouldn't have said that. Love is higher for him, but it's not love of your city. I mean, he was obviously patriotic. He fought in dozens of campaigns as a hoplite soldier. But ultimately, love was love of wisdom for him, philosophia, love of truth. I'm not saying that Aspasia wouldn't have felt that too, but I just feel that that intermediate step might be something for which we have evidence in the funeral speech. So that's a long answer. Answer, possibly they had an affair, possibly he fell in love and was let down by her. But there's clearly a relationship we need to take into account.